In the heart of Seoul, where ancient palaces cast long shadows over gleaming skyscrapers, two worlds were about to collide in the most unexpected way. This is a story of destiny, redemption, and a love that would challenge everything society believed about second chances. Princess Han So-young had never imagined she would find herself in a place like this. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cold concrete walls of Seoul Detention Center. As the youngest daughter of the Han Group Empire, one of South Korea's most powerful conglomerates, she had lived her entire 26 years surrounded by luxury, privilege, and carefully orchestrated perfection. But here she was, clutching a manila envelope containing legal documents that would change everything. Her designer heels clicked against the polished floor as she followed the guard down a seemingly endless corridor. Each step echoed like a countdown to a moment she both dreaded and desperately needed. "Visitor for Kim Min-jae," she heard herself say at the registration desk, her voice steadier than she felt. The officer looked up, clearly recognizing her face from countless magazine covers and society pages. His eyes widened slightly, but professional discretion kept him from commenting. So-young had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this meeting, 3 nights staring at the case file that had landed on her desk at the Han Group's legal department. Kim Min-jae, 28 years old, serving a 7-year sentence for armed robbery. What the file didn't mention, what she had discovered through her own investigation, was that this man might be the key to clearing her father's name from a scandal that threatened to destroy their family legacy. The visiting room was sterile and unwelcoming, with its rows of plastic chairs separated by thick glass partitions. So-young chose a seat in the middle, away from the other visitors who spoke in hushed, urgent tones to their loved ones on the other side. She placed her hands on the metal counter, noticing how they trembled slightly, betraying the calm facade she had perfected over years of public appearances. When the door on the other side opened, she felt her breath catch. Kim Min-jae was not what she expected. The man who walked toward her carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with his surroundings. His dark hair was neatly combed, his prison uniform clean and pressed, but it was his eyes that surprised her most. Intelligent, guarded, yet somehow still holding a flicker of hope that prison hadn't managed to extinguish. You sat down across from her, picked up the phone, and waited. So-young realized she was staring and quickly lifted her own receiver. "You're not what I expected," were the first words out of her mouth, immediately regretting how they sounded. A small smile played at the corner of his lips. "And you're exactly what I expected, Princess Han." The way he said her title, not with mockery, but with a kind of resigned understanding, made her uncomfortable. She was used to people either fawning over her status or resenting it, but Min-jae seemed to simply accept it as a fact of life. "I need to ask you about the night of March 15th, 2019. She began, opening her folder and spreading the documents where he could see them through the glass. "The robbery at the Gangnam convenience store." His expression hardened immediately. "I already told the police everything. I told the lawyers everything. I told the judge everything. What makes you think I have anything new to say to you?" "Because," she leaned forward, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper, "I think you're protecting someone, and I think that someone has information about my father's case." For a long moment, Min-jae said nothing. He studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see through all her carefully constructed walls. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Your father's case," he repeated slowly. "The one where he's accused of embezzling funds meant for low-income housing projects? The one where, if he's found guilty, hundreds of families will lose their homes?" So-young nodded, surprised by how much he knew. The evidence against him was planted. Someone wanted him out of the way, and they're using those families as leverage. If I can't prove his innocence, Han Group will collapse, and those housing projects will never be completed. And you think I know who did it? I think you saw who did it. The convenience store you robbed was across the street from the building where the fake documents were planted in my father's office. The security footage from that night was mysteriously corrupted, but you were there. You saw something. Min-jae was quiet for so long that So-young began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What makes you think I'll help you? Your family represents everything that's wrong with this country. The rich getting richer while people like me fight for scraps. The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth, but So-young had come too far to back down now. Because, she said, meeting his gaze steadily, if my father goes down, he won't be the only one who suffers. Hundreds of families will lose their homes, thousands of employees will lose their jobs, and the real criminal will get away with everything. She paused, then added quietly, and because I think, despite everything that's happened to you, you're still someone who cares about justice. 3 days later, So-young found herself in a place she never thought she'd visit again.
The law library at Seoul National University, where she had spent countless hours during her law school days before her father convinced her to join the family business instead of pursuing her dream of becoming a prosecutor. The manila folders spread across the wooden table contained everything she could gather about Min-jae's case, her father's situation, and the mysterious connections between them. After their first meeting, Min-jae had agreed to see her again, but he had made one thing clear. If she wanted his help, she would have to prove that she was serious about finding the truth, not just protecting her family's reputation. "You came back," Min-jae said when she sat down across from him for their second visit. This time, his tone held a note of surprise. "I told you I would." So-young opened her folder and pulled out a photograph. "Do you recognize this man?" Min-jae studied the picture, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit taken at what appeared to be a corporate function. "Should I?" "His name is Park Tae-sok. He's the current CEO of Daehan Construction, the company that was supposed to build the housing projects. He's also the person who stands to gain the most if my father's projects are canceled and the contracts are reassigned." She pulled out another document. "The night you robbed that convenience store, Park Tae-sok's car was parked in the building across the street from 11:30 p.m. to 2:15 a.m. I got this from the parking garage security system." Min-jae's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've been busy." "I spent 2 years in law school before my father convinced me that business was more practical than justice. Turns out, old habits die hard." She leaned forward. "The question is, did you see him that night?" For the first time since they'd met, Min-jae looked uncertain. He set down the phone and ran a hand through his hair, clearly wrestling with some internal conflict. "If I tell you what I saw," he said finally, "it won't just be your father's reputation on the line. There are other people involved, good people, who could get hurt." "What kind of people?" Min-jae was quiet for a long moment. Then, as if making a decision that would change everything, he began to speak. "The convenience store robbery wasn't random. I was broke, desperate, and stupid, but I wasn't a career criminal. I chose that store because I'd been watching it for days, trying to work up the courage to go through with it. What I didn't expect was to witness something that would haunt me for the rest of my life." He paused, his grip tightening on the phone. "I sat in the alley, behind the store, working up the nerve to walk in, and I saw a black sedan pull up to the building across the street. 3 men got out. One of them was the man in your photograph, Park Tae-sok. The other 2 looked like security or maybe hired muscle." So-young felt her heart racing. What did they do? "They went into the building using some kind of access card. About 20 minutes later, they came back out. One of them was carrying a briefcase that he didn't have when they went in. They drove off, and 10 minutes later, I walked into that convenience store and made the worst decision of my life. Why didn't you tell the police? Min Jae's laugh was bitter. Tell them what? That I was planning to rob a store when I witnessed what might have been a crime? And even if they believed me, who do you think they'd rather prosecute? A poor kid from the wrong side of Seoul, or one of the most powerful businessmen in the country? So Young stared at him, beginning to understand the impossible position he'd been in. So you took the fall for the robbery and kept quiet about what you saw. I took the fall because I actually committed the robbery, Min Jae corrected. But yes, I kept quiet about the rest, until now. What changed your mind? Min Jae looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression made her breath catch. You did, he said simply. You could have sent lawyers or investigators, you could have offered me money or threatened me with more jail time. Instead, you came here yourself, looked me in the eye, and talked about justice. Either you're a better actress than most politicians, or you actually mean what you say.
Over the following weeks, an unlikely partnership began to form. So Young would visit Min Jae twice a week, always during regular visiting hours, always maintaining the pretense of legal consultation. But their conversations had evolved far beyond the simple exchange of information. Min Jae, she discovered, had a mind as sharp as any lawyer she'd worked with. Despite his lack of formal education, he dropped out of high school to work and support his younger sister. He had an intuitive understanding of human nature and an eye for detail that proved invaluable in piecing together the conspiracy they were uncovering. "Your problem," Min Jae said during one of their sessions, studying the timeline So Young had constructed, "is that you're thinking like a rich person." So Young looked up from her notes, slightly offended. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You're assuming that everyone involved in this conspiracy is motivated by money or power. But what if someone was motivated by something else? What if someone was forced to participate?" "Forced how?" Min Jae pointed to a name on her list, Dr. Yoon Hae-jin, the forensic accountant who had discovered the supposedly incriminating evidence in her father's files. "Look at the timeline again. Dr. Yoon filed her report on a Friday. The following Monday, her daughter started at Seoul International Academy, one of the most expensive private schools in the city. That's not a coincidence." So Young felt a chill run down her spine. "You think they threatened her daughter?" "I think they offered her something she couldn't refuse, a better life for her child in exchange for her cooperation." Min Jae's expression was grim. "It's a lot easier to manipulate someone when you're not just threatening them, but when you're offering to solve their biggest problem." This insight led So Young to investigate the personal lives of everyone involved in her father's case. What she found painted a disturbing picture of systematic manipulation. The lead prosecutor had suddenly been able to afford his mother's expensive cancer treatment. The judge's son had miraculously been accepted to a university despite mediocre grades. The investigative journalist who had broken the story had just signed a lucrative book deal. Each person had received exactly what they needed most, creating a web of obligation that made the conspiracy nearly impossible to unravel. "It's brilliant in a horrifying way," So Young admitted during one of their conversations. "They didn't just buy people off, they made them complicit in their own manipulation." "Which means they're all victims too, in a sense," Min Jae replied. "That could work in our favor if we approach this right." But as their investigation deepened, So Young began to realize that something else was happening between them. The long hours spent discussing strategy, sharing theories, and gradually revealing their personal histories had created an intimacy that neither of them had expected. She found herself looking forward to their meetings with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the case. She noticed how Min Jae's eyes lit up when he explained a particularly clever insight, how his rare smiles transformed his entire face, how he listened to her ideas with a respect and attention that she rarely received in her privileged world. For his part, Min-jae had begun to see beyond the princess title to the woman underneath, someone who was using her privilege not to protect herself, but to seek justice for others. He watched her passion for the truth, her willingness to risk her family's reputation for what was right, and found himself drawn to her in ways that terrified him. The realization hit So-young one evening as she sat in her penthouse apartment, surrounded by case files and legal documents. She wasn't just fighting to save her father. She was fighting for Min-jae too, for his freedom, for his future, for the chance to explore whatever was growing between them. But the obstacles seemed insurmountable. Even if they could prove her father's innocence and expose the conspiracy, Min-jae would still be a convicted felon. She would still be a chaebol princess. The social gulf between them wasn't something that evidence and legal briefs could bridge. The first sign that they were getting close to the truth came in the form of a warning. So-young arrived at her office one morning to find her assistant, pale and shaking, holding a manila envelope. This was delivered an hour ago. The delivery man said it was urgent. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, So-young and Min-jae during one of their meetings at the detention center, clearly taken with a telephoto lens. On the back, someone had written in block letters, "Some friendships are more expensive than others." So-young felt her blood run cold. Whoever was behind the conspiracy knew about their investigation and wasn't afraid to let her know they were being watched. She immediately called her security team and arranged for additional protection, but her first instinct was to warn Min-jae. However, she couldn't visit him without potentially putting him in more danger, and phone calls to inmates were monitored. The solution came from an unexpected source. Min-jae's sister, Kim Soo-jin, contacted So-young through the Han Group's main number, claiming to have information about her brother's case. They met at a small cafe in Hongdae, far from the business district where So-young might be recognized. Soo-jin was a younger, softer version of her brother, with the same intelligent eyes, but without the guardedness that prison had given Min-jae. "He made me promise not to contact you," Soo-jin said, stirring her coffee nervously. "But I'm worried about him. He's been getting threatening messages from other inmates. Someone is putting pressure on him to stop talking to you." I felt my heart sink. What kind of pressure? The kind that could get him killed. So-young felt her heart sink. Soo-jin's voice was matter-of-fact, but her hands were shaking. "My brother is a good person, Miss Han. He made one terrible mistake, but he spent every day since then trying to make up for it. He tutors other inmates. He mediates disputes. He's even prevented 2 suicides. He doesn't deserve to die because he's trying to help you find the truth." "What do you want me to do?" Soo-jin leaned forward, her expression intense. "Stop the investigation. Find another way to save your father. Don't let my brother become collateral damage in a war between powerful people." So-young stared at her, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. If she continued the investigation, she might be signing Min-jae's death warrant. If she stopped, her father would go to prison, hundreds of families would lose their homes, and the real criminals would get away with everything. "There might be another way," So-young said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "But it would require your brother to trust me completely, and it would be very dangerous for both of us." What So-young proposed was audacious, illegal, and absolutely insane. It was also their only chance. "You want to break my brother out of prison?" Soo-jin stared at her in disbelief. "Are you completely out of your mind?" "Not break him out. Get him transferred to minimum security, then arrange for him to be released on a technicality. I have connections in the legal system, people who owe my family favors. With the right paperwork and the right timing, we can make it look completely legitimate." "And then what? He'd be a fugitive." "No, he'd be free on a legal technicality while his case is being reviewed. It happens more often than you think. The key is making sure that by the time anyone realizes what happened, we already have enough evidence to prove the conspiracy and get his conviction overturned."
Sujin was quiet for a long moment. "This could destroy your family if it goes wrong. Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know?" So-young had been asking herself the same question for weeks. The rational answer was that Min-jae was the key witness they needed to expose the conspiracy. But the real answer was more complicated, more personal, and more frightening than she wanted to admit. "Because," she said finally, "sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks that don't make sense to anyone else." The plan they eventually developed was complex, requiring precise timing and a little bit of luck. So-young would use her connections to arrange for Min-jae's transfer to a minimum security facility on the grounds that he was cooperating with an ongoing investigation. From there, a clerical error would result in his early release for good behavior. Meanwhile, Sujin would gather evidence from her contacts in the construction industry, people who had been affected by the housing project delays and might be willing to testify if they knew it could lead to justice. The most dangerous part of the plan fell to So-young herself. She would have to confront Park Tae-suk directly, wearing a wire and trying to get him to incriminate himself on tape. It was the kind of move that could get her killed if Park suspected what she was doing. "I don't like this," Min-jae said when So-young explained the plan during what might be their last official meeting. "You're putting yourself in too much danger." "It's the only way," So-young replied. "We need a confession, and Park is arrogant enough that he might give us one if he thinks he's in control of the situation." "And if he doesn't? If he realizes what you're doing?" So-young met him through the glass partition. "Then I guess we'll find out just how far fate is willing to bend for us."
She arranged it under the pretense of discussing a potential partnership between their companies, something that would benefit both of them if her father's legal troubles went away. She wore a designer suit that concealed the recording device taped to her chest, and she'd spent hours practicing how to guide the conversation toward the topics they needed on tape. Her hands were steady, her voice was calm, but inside her heart was racing. Park was exactly what she had expected, smooth, confident, and utterly without conscience. He welcomed her into his office with the kind of practiced charm that powerful men used when they wanted something. "Princess Han," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his massive desk. "I have to admit I was surprised when you called. Given your family's current difficulties, I wasn't sure you'd be in a position to discuss new business ventures." "That's exactly why I'm here," So-young replied, settling into her chair and crossing her legs. "My father's situation is unfortunate, but it's also temporary. When he's cleared of these charges, and he will be, Han Group will remember who stood by us during this difficult time." Park's smile widened. "Optimistic. I like that. Though I have to wonder what makes you so confident about the outcome of his trial." "Because I know my father, and I know he's innocent." So-young leaned forward slightly. "The question is, do you know who's really behind this? Because when the truth comes out, and it will, anyone who was involved in framing him is going to face some very serious consequences." For a moment, something flickered behind Park's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. Then the smooth mask was back in place. "Framing him? That's a very serious accusation, Miss Han. Are you suggesting that someone planted evidence against your father?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating it as fact." So-young's voice was steady, but she could feel sweat beading on her forehead. "The evidence against my father was fabricated. The witnesses were coerced. The whole case is a setup designed to remove him from the housing project so that someone else could take over the contracts." Park leaned back in his chair, studying her with newfound interest. "And who do you think would do such a thing?" Someone who had access to my father's office building. Someone who knew exactly where to plant the evidence so it would be found. Someone who stood to gain millions of dollars from the housing contracts. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Someone like you. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. So-young could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the recording device pressing against her chest. Everything depended on what Park said next. Finally, he began to laugh, a low, genuinely amused chuckle that made her blood run cold. "You know," he said, still smiling, "I always admired your father's intelligence. It's a shame his daughter didn't inherit more of it." "What's that supposed to mean?" Park stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Seoul. "It means, my dear princess, that you're absolutely right about everything, but you're also completely powerless to do anything about it." So-young felt her breath catch. "Are you confessing?" "I'm stating facts." Park turned back to face her. "Yes, I orchestrated your father's downfall. Yes, I planted the evidence. Yes, I coerced the witnesses. And yes, I'm going to make billions of dollars from the housing contract that will be reassigned to my company when your father goes to prison." The casual way he admitted to destroying her father's life made So-young's hands clench into fists. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because, sweet, naive princess, what are you going to do about it? Who are you going to tell? The prosecutors who are already in my pocket? The judges who owe me favors? The media that depends on my advertising revenue? You have no power here. You never did." "You're wrong about that." The voice came from behind So-young, and she spun around to see Min Jae standing in the doorway of Park's office. He was wearing civilian clothes, and for a moment she couldn't process how he could possibly be there. Park's confident expression faltered. "Who the hell are you? How did you get in here?" "I'm Kim Min Jae, and I'm the witness who's going to put you in prison for the rest of your life." The next few minutes passed in a blur of accusations, denials, and revelations that would later make headlines across South Korea. Min Jae, it turned out, had been released that morning on the legal technicalities So-young had arranged, and he had arrived just in time to hear Park's confession. But Park wasn't finished. As the reality of his situation sank in, his facade of control began to crumble, revealing the desperation underneath. "You think this changes anything? You think one recording is going to bring down everything I've built? I have judges, prosecutors, politicians, people you can't even imagine in my pocket. This will never see the inside of a courtroom." "Actually," said a new voice from the doorway, "it already has." Prosecutor Kim Ye-won entered the office, followed by 2 police officers. So-young recognized her from news reports. She was known for taking on corruption cases that other prosecutors wouldn't touch. "Prosecutor Kim," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, "this is all a misunderstanding. These people broke into my office." "These people," Prosecutor Kim interrupted, "have been working with my office for the past 3 weeks. Everything you just said was broadcast live to a grand jury that has been waiting in the courthouse across the street." So-young felt her knees go weak with relief. The plan had worked, not just the recording, but the larger trap they had set with the prosecutor's office. Min Jae's early release was part of a cooperation agreement that would see his conviction overturned in exchange for his testimony. But Park wasn't finished. As the reality of his situation sank in, his facade of control began to crumble, revealing the desperation underneath. You think this changes anything? You think one recording is going to bring down everything I've built? I have judges, prosecutors, politicians, people you can't even imagine in my pocket. This will never see the inside of a courtroom. Actually, visited Park by a prosecutor, Kim Ye-won. These people have been working with my office for the past 3 weeks. Everything you just said was broadcast live to a grand jury that has been waiting in the courthouse across the street. So-young felt her knees go weak with relief. The plan had worked. Not just the recording, but the larger trap they had set with the prosecutor's office. Min-jae's early release was part of a cooperation agreement that would see his conviction overturned in exchange for his testimony. As the police officers placed Park under arrest, he turned to So-young with pure hatred in his eyes. You have no idea what you've done. This goes higher than you think, deeper than you can imagine. Getting me won't end this. It will just make the rest of them more careful. So-young met his gaze steadily. Then we'll find them too. However long it takes, however deep we have to dig, justice isn't a sprint, Mr. Park. It's a marathon. 6 months later, So-young stood in the courtroom as the judge read the verdict in her father's case. The charges against him had been dropped. The real evidence of his innocence had been presented, and the housing projects that had been put on hold were finally moving forward. Park Tae-sok had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for conspiracy, fraud, and corruption. His confession had led to a wider investigation that had exposed a network of corruption involving dozens of politicians, judges, and business leaders. The scandal, which the media had dubbed Operation Clean House, was being called the largest anti-corruption investigation in South Korean history. But for So-young, the most important outcome was sitting in the gallery behind her. Min-jae's conviction had been officially overturned, and he was a free man. More than that, he had been offered a position with the prosecutor's office as a consultant on white-collar crime cases, his unique perspective and natural investigatory instincts making him invaluable in understanding how criminals thought and operated. After the hearing, they walked out of the courthouse together, pausing at the top of the steps to look out over the city that had tested both of them so thoroughly.
Set over Seoul, So-young and Min-jae danced to music played by a string quartet that included 2 of Min-jae's former fellow inmates who had learned their instruments while in prison. Around them, the city lights began to twinkle, each one representing lives that had been touched in some small way by their story. They had started as strangers on opposite sides of an impossible divide. They had become partners in seeking justice, allies in fighting corruption, and eventually 2 people who had found in each other something worth risking everything for. Their story would be told and retold in the years that followed, in newspapers, in books, and eventually in a television drama that would become one of the most popular shows in Korean history. But for So-young and Min-jae, the most important part of their story was still being written, one day at a time, one case at a time, one small act of justice at a time. Because they had learned that fate didn't just bring people together, it challenged them to become better than they ever thought possible. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, it gave you exactly the person you needed to help you change the world. In the distance, the lights of Seoul stretched out like a sea of possibilities, and 2 people who had once lived in completely different worlds danced together under the stars, proving that love, justice, and second chances were the most powerful forces of all.
And I don't think I know you well enough either. So-young wiped away a tear that had escaped despite her composure. The man I thought I was marrying would never have fallen in love with my sister. He would have been too controlled, too concerned with appearances. But the man sitting across from me right now, the one who's been honest enough to tell me the truth, even though it would have been easier to lie, I think I like him better. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the end of their engagement and the strange relief that came with admitting they had never been right for each other. "What happens now?" So-young asked. "I don't know. I have to cancel a wedding, face both our families, figure out how to tell Sojin that I chose her without knowing if she'll choose me back." Minjun ran a hand through his hair. "Your mother is going to kill me." "Actually, she might surprise you. Mother has always been more practical than romantic. She'd rather have both her daughters happy than maintain a marriage that was doomed from the start." So-young gathered her purse, preparing to leave. "But you should know, if you hurt Sojin, if you break her heart after everything she sacrificed for this decision, I will make your life very difficult." "I wouldn't expect anything less." So-young stood, then leaned down to kiss his cheek one last time. "For what it's worth, I hope it works out. Sojin deserves someone who looks at her the way you do when you say her name." After she left, Minjun sat alone in the restaurant, feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. He had burned the bridge back to his old life, but he still didn't know if Sojin would meet him on the other side. Finding Sojin took longer than expected. She wasn't at the bookshop, and when Minjun went to her apartment building, the elderly woman who managed the front desk told him she hadn't seen her in days. Finally, on a hunch, he went to the university library where she had mentioned doing research. He found her in the literature section, surrounded by stacks of books and papers, looking like she hadn't slept in days. When she saw him approaching, her face went pale. "Minjun, what are you doing here? Someone might see us." "I broke up with So-young." Sojin's pen slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the table. "You what?" "I broke up with So-young. I told her everything, about us, about how I feel, about why I can't marry her. The wedding is off." "Oh my God." Sojin buried her face in her hands. "Oh my God, Minjun, what have you done?" "I chose you. I chose us. But I told you. You told me you couldn't be the person who destroyed your sister's happiness. Well, now you're not. I'm the one who ended the engagement. I'm the one who will deal with the consequences." Minjian reached across the table and gently pulled her hands away from her face. "So-young knows about us. Your mother knows about us, and they both think we should be together." Sojin stared at him as if he had grown a second head. "My mother thinks we should be together? She thinks So-young and I were wrong for each other, and that you and I might actually be right. She's worried about you, Sojin. She says you've been miserable." "I have been miserable. I've been completely miserable. But that doesn't mean... just because you ended your engagement doesn't mean we can automatically..." "Can't we?" Minjun's voice was soft but intense. "What's stopping us now? Your sister is handling this better than either of us expected. Your mother is on our side. My family will be furious for a while, but they'll get over it eventually. The social consequences will be uncomfortable, but not insurmountable." Sojin looked around the library as if seeing it for the first time. "People will talk. They'll say I seduced you away from my sister, that I'm a homewrecker. People will talk no matter what we do. The question is whether we're going to let their opinions determine how we live our lives. And if this doesn't work out, if we try this and realize we were wrong about each other..." Minjun leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then at least we'll know. At least we'll have tried instead of spending the rest of our lives wondering what if." Sojin was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with tears, but there was something else there too. Hope. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I. This is going to be complicated." "Probably. Everyone's going to have opinions about what we should do." "Definitely. And we might be making the biggest mistake of our lives." "We might be. Or we might be making the best decision we've ever made." Sojin smiled through her tears. "You really ended your engagement for me." "I ended my engagement because I realized I was in love with you, and marrying someone else while feeling this way would have been unfair to everyone involved. But yes, I chose you. I will always choose you." When Sojin stood to meet him, when she let him take her hands and pull her close, when she looked up at him with love and trust and residual fear all mixed together in her expression, Minju knew they were going to be okay. Not because it would be easy, it wouldn't be, but because they had finally stopped running from what they felt for each other. "So, what happens now?" Sojin asked. "Now we figure it out as we go. We deal with our families, we face whatever social consequences come our way, and we see if this thing between us is strong enough to survive in the real world. And if people say we're crazy, then we'll be crazy together." Sojin laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the quiet library. "I can't believe you did this. I can't believe you actually chose me. I told you I would. I told you I would always choose you." The autumn rain had stopped, and Seoul stretched out beyond the library windows, full of possibility and promise. Minjun and Sojin stood together among the books and papers, surrounded by thousands of stories about love and loss, and the courage it took to reach for happiness even when it seemed impossible. They had a long road ahead of them, conversations with family members, explanations to friends, the delicate work of building a relationship in the aftermath of the chaos they had created. But for the first time in weeks, Minjun felt like he could breathe freely. He had stopped pretending to want a life that was wrong for him, and he had found someone who saw him clearly and loved him anyway. 6 months later, Minjun and Sojin were married in a small ceremony in the same neighborhood where they had first met. So-young was there, radiant in her role as maid of honor, having found her own happiness with someone who loved her for herself rather than what she represented. As Minjin watched his new wife laugh at something her sister whispered to her during the reception, he thought about all the novels Sojin had told him about, stories of impossible love that either ended in tragedy or triumph, depending on the courage of the characters. Their story was still being written, but Minjin was confident about the ending. They had chosen each other despite every obstacle, every social expectation, every rational argument against their love, and in choosing each other, they had discovered that sometimes the most impossible thing is also the most necessary, the thing that makes all the risk and uncertainty worthwhile. The bookshop where they first met still displayed a small handwritten sign in the window. "Every story has the potential to change a life." Minjun smiled every time he passed it, knowing exactly how true those words could be.